I'm not actually checking my emails. I'm just seeing how we're going for time. Jennifer, you did your BA, I believe, in Wellington, and then you did a teaching diploma in Auckland. So who were you back then? What did you want to do? What were your plans?
Well, I had hair down to here like most other people, and long skirts down to here, so we're talking about the 70s. And I think I wanted to change the world, actually. That didn't seem a very difficult thing
Initially
to do.
by being a teacher?
Well, actually, yes.
Yeah. I'm not saying that that's a funny way to change the world.
When I started at university, I thought I was going to be a town planner, Bill, because I was good at geography. And then I thought I'd be a social worker. And then in my first year out of university, I worked in the Leslie Children's Home, which had been an orphanage.
Wow.
Presbyterian orphanage up in Meadowbank. And I just felt that the children were being they weren't mistreated, but they weren't getting any opportunities. And so I thought, I want to be a primary school teacher and I want to change these children, not those children, but I wanted to change children's lives. So I came up here and...
and you taught for a while?
I taught for one glorious year. And I don't know, there may be a few teachers in the room. Primary schools in New Zealand in the 70s were pretty conservative places.
I think I went to one.
Yes, and I found that really there was not a lot of room for a young, energetic teacher who thought that things could be done differently.
So you felt a little stifled?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Where were you teaching?
I was teaching in South Auckland in Manarewa.
Right. So you'd come in like all young people, idealistic, wanting to help children. Were you disheartened after that year or during that year?
No, I wasn't disheartened, but I felt ground down by it.
Right.
And we'd got involved in Corso, which at the time was New Zealand's premier overseas aid organisation.
Gosh, you don't hear that word so much anymore,
Yes, you don't. You know, I can tell you why. But so I got offered a job at Corso at the end of my first year's teaching, and as you do when you're 20-something, there's a better opportunity, so you take that opportunity. So then I started working in overseas aid in New Zealand.
So, I mean, I've seen you described as the mother of philanthropy. It's like being the mother of the nation, isn't it?
It's rather nice, isn't it?
And it's obviously because it's been your life's work in many ways. And you're describing those early signs of this. Were there even earlier signs? I mean, do you think, looking back now, that as a child, perhaps, that there was some inevitability about what you ended up doing?
I think it's interesting. My dad was in the army, so I spent the first 7 years of my life in Waiouru. And I remember an incident where everybody in the school, I don't know if there's anyone here who grew up in the army, but you know absolutely where you stand in relation to everybody else in the class whose father is also in the army. And then children used to come in from the small rural settlements in buses, so those kids weren't in the army. So there was a very strange kind of class system, really, I think, operating in the school. And I remember during my second year, this little girl who came in from Hihitahi on the bus, and the teacher pulled her up to the front of the room, and in those days children got whacked on the bottom, and he pulled her dress up and she had no underpants on, and he whacked her bottom in front of the whole class. And I was 6, and I was outraged. I was absolutely outraged. So yeah, maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah.
What appealed to you then about philanthropy work? I mean, was there a moment in your early career beyond teaching that you felt like, I've found the thing?
Not really, but I worked in the not-for-profit sector, and one of the things that happens when you work in the not-for-profit sector is you apply for money.
Yes.
And the people you apply to money for are philanthropic trusts. And I got approached by Sir Roy Mackenzie, who I think is probably New Zealand's greatest ever philanthropist. And he was looking for someone to run his private foundation. And someone said, Roy Mackenzie's looking for someone to work for him and he'd like to meet you. So I went into his office, he offered me a job, I started work for him the next day, and my life's never been the same.
Tell us a little bit about him, just very briefly. Who was he?
So for those of us of a certain generation will remember that in every New Zealand town there was a Mackenzie's on one side of the road and a Woolworths on the other.
That's right.
So John Robert Mackenzie started Mackenzie's, and Sir Roy Mackenzie was his son. And at the time that Sir Robert died, he was the wealthiest man in Australasia and set up the J.R. Mackenzie Trust, which was
Right.
the largest philanthropic trust in Australasia. So Roy was his son, and he had set up a number of philanthropic initiatives, and I worked with him for 10 years. I worked in his office alongside him on his philanthropic projects, and it was just the most glorious decade.
So before that, working in not-for-profit, you've been applying for funds from
Absolutely.
the kind of organisation
Yes.
that you ended up working for.
That's right.
So
I went
better
from-
being on the doling outside?
Better to be the gamekeeper than the poacher, absolutely. Yeah.
I suppose a lot of people conflate the ideas of charity and philanthropy, and I just wonder if there is a good distinction or even a distinction.
Well,
What do you...
I think there's a distinction. I mean, charity is the giving of services. Philanthropy is the allocation of resources. Philanthropy generally comes from people who have something to spare. And it can be both good and bad. But when good philanthropy is done well, it has the power to transform communities and societies.
I mean, I know you do hear sometimes the criticism that, philanthropy taken to the logical extremes absolves the state of its responsibilities to its citizens, and I'm sure you've encountered that argument. What do you say to people that say that?
I think that particularly in New Zealand we essentially live in a social democracy, and I think there's fundamentally an accord between those of us who pay our taxes and the government who spends it. And if you look at an institution like the university obviously receives a significant amount of taxpayer money, but it also receives significant philanthropic funding, which enables it to do those extra things. And I think that's a functioning democracy. I mean, the interesting thing that if you look back over the various totalitarian regimes of both the right and the left that the world's seen in the last 50 years, the first thing that often happens in a totalitarian regime is you shut down both philanthropy and charity.
Why
And
is
so
that?
I think philanthropy and the not-for-profit sector round out a society.
Might be a naive question, but why do philanthropists want to be philanthropists? What is there a common motivation that you've encountered? What?
I think that's a very good question. Sometimes it's about ego, and they aren't always the best philanthropists. The best philanthropists are the ones you don't know about. But it's often people. I mean, John Robert Mackenzie, who started Mackenzie's stores, grew up very poor, emigrated from Glasgow to Australia, started a small business, became very successful. And when he emigrated to New Zealand in the 50s, just before he died, he talked about giving back to the nation. So he had known poverty. He grew to have enormous wealth, and he wanted to give back to the nation. And I think for those philanthropists who are giving back, then it's sharing.
And you can't take it with you after all.
And you can't take it with you,
as
no.
far as we know. Your current work involves Foundation North. Just briefly, where does Foundation North's funding come from, and what's its mission statement?
Right. So 30 years ago, the Auckland Savings Bank was sold under the Trustee Savings Bank Restructuring Act, and so that created a philanthropic foundation to serve the people of Auckland and Northland. So we now have an endowment of well over $1 billion, which makes us the largest philanthropic trust in New Zealand, and we support projects across Auckland and Northland, and we're absolutely clear about wanting to make a difference to the people to the people in our communities who struggle the most.
So this is the question for the gamekeeper. You must have so many competing claims and appeals for grants and so on. How do you make those decisions? Obviously based on merit, I'm sure, but there's a subjectivity to it as well, I imagine.
You have to have a clear strategy. You have to know what it is that you want to do. So if you're looking at Northland, for example, you're looking at unemployed young people, lack of industry, lack of jobs, lack of opportunity. So it becomes very clear very quickly where you'll put the resources that you've got.
But then you have to manage and monitor what happens to it. How effective can you be as a sort of a manager of what happens to those funds once they're...
I think you're an enabler. I think it's really clear. I mean, I often say to my trustees, and I don't know if any of them are here, they don't like to hear this, we don't actually do anything. What we do is enable communities to come up with solutions. And I think that's really important.
One that really caught my eye was the City Mission project right here in downtown Auckland, which I think you've given $10 million, with that, and that's the largest
Single grant we've given. Yes.
largest grant you've made. Why is that so significant? Why did it get such a big chunk, and what was the decision-making process around that?
Because I think Auckland's changed. I moved here 14 years ago from Wellington, and when I first came to the foundation, every year the City Mission and other charities do a rough, every year on a particular day they do their own census, if you like, of rough sleepers. And when I first came to Auckland, there was something like 130 rough sleepers in Auckland, and the social agencies knew them all by name. And one of my staff went to a conference in San Francisco and was talking about this, and someone in the conference said to her, if there's only 130 rough sleepers in Auckland, why don't you just buy them a house? And, you know, we're buying a house. But the problem has got completely out of control in the last decade, and we owe it to those people who, for no fault of their own, have nowhere to live, and who have multiple really, really complex problems that they're facing in their lives.
And for those who don't know, just very briefly, the expansion of the City Mission site, architecturally and and in terms of scale, will be really significant.
It will be
won't
beautiful. It's going to be a large wooden building. It's going to be absolutely stunning.
But I suppose it's one of those instances where you really don't want the old adage of, build it and they will come to be true.
Build it and they will leave. Build it and they will
Ideally.
be rehabilitated and they will leave.
And I suppose
And it can then be repurposed. It has been built so that it can be repurposed. So maybe one day we won't need that building.
let's hope.
Let's hope.
You were made ONZM last year. You've been recognised in many other ways, including Kiwi Bank Local Hero. So what's this little accolade mean to you personally?
Oh. Well, it's interesting thinking about it and think about university, because I actually wasn't a particularly good student. I mean, I passed everything, but I wasn't
I'm glad to know there's two of us on this stage.
I wasn't an A student, and I didn't go on and do postgraduate study. And it's actually really nice for the university to say to someone with a BA, dip teach, dip ed, you did well. I like that.
And didn't you?
I like that.
Jennifer Gill, everyone.